Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. Thank you for joining us. Stephen is going to be teaching on James 5, 17, and 18. It is the second to the last passage in his entire series on the book of James. This is the 20th teaching in this book. And I want to remind everyone about the book of James, that James is speaking of something different than Paul is speaking of. James is speaking of a Moses plus Jesus hermeneutic, whereas Legacy Bible Church teaches Moses plus Jesus still equals Moses. But Jesus came to abolish the law. Jesus came and he fulfilled the law. But James is still teaching that you have Jesus and you still have to follow the law. Now, of course, Stephen teaches that the commandments are great to follow, but history, Old Testament, teaches us that man can't follow that. Jesus is the answer for the law. So there is a difference in the teaching in who James is talking to, and he and I were talking today. James is talking to a Jewish consort. He's talking to people who know Hebrew, who have a Jewish background, who know the Torah. Paul's speaking to the same group, but he's also speaking to the Gentiles who don't have Hebrew background in the Torah. But am I saying that right, Stephen? So he's wording things different, but also James is still teaching to Torah. And Paul is teaching that Jesus is all that you need. So there's a conflict between these two teachers who are both teaching that Jesus saves. One's just adding Moses till salvation, and Paul is teaching that Jesus is all that you need. And also, quite frankly, you can't follow Moses anyway, because if that could be followed, Christ wouldn't have needed to come and save us. So he's going to teach on this second to the last passage, James 5, chapter 17 through 18. So welcome, and I hope you enjoy this teaching. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Well, good afternoon, Legacy Bible Church. A little bit bittersweet here as I land this plane, this big plane called the Letter from James, after this is the 20th session, and we'll have one more, and it's going to be, we'll land it next week. I'm going to read in the entire final passage. I call it the final exhortation. It's after James' entire literary masterpiece that he and those who helped him. James didn't write this by himself, I promise you. He had helpers probably from the sect of the Pharisees and probably from the synagogue community in Jerusalem from the region where Paul was from, Tarsus. They had a synagogue community in Jerusalem. That's what Paul belonged to and was part of when he was a student training to become a Pharisee, and that's was his status when after martyring Stephen in AD 34, and on his way with letters from the chief priests, letters of commendation from the chief priests at Jerusalem to harass and arrest and who knows what else, the new Christian community at Damascus. The Lord Jesus met him on the road to Damascus, and the rest is history. Paul became a follower of Jesus Christ and says a lot about how the salvation plan of God works. A lot of bad teaching and bad theology in the church, that, if you want a theological term for it, universal atonement says that Christ died on the cross and the grace of God is now available to all human beings, and it depends solely on the volitional decision of any human being to hear the gospel and say, yeah, I think I want to become a follower of Jesus Christ. And there's even a favorite song in many churches is I have decided, you know, the song, I have decided to follow Jesus. And that's a great song. I don't mind singing it. It's just not very good theology, because Paul, I promise you, was not on his way to Damascus singing that song. He was on his way to Damascus to harass the new Christian community there, to arrest them and to bring them back to Jerusalem to stand before the Sanhedrin and the chief priests, and to be forcibly forced to renounce their Christian faith and affirm only Moses. That was Paul. The Lord met him on the road to Damascus, and like I said, the rest is history. The salvation plan of God works that way. God sovereignly works to redeem those whom he chooses to redeem. And to those of us who are redeemed, we can look back at my redemption and see two things. I was absolutely adamant that I could not cede to this idea of the resurrection. It just, as good as it sounded, my mind just couldn't click to say, I can see that God raised Jesus from the dead. I couldn't get there. Just couldn't happen. I would have liked to. It'd be nice if I could just say, okay, I'm going to believe that. But being honest, and that really faith is a realm of deep internal honesty. It's a type of honesty you almost can't articulate with words. It's an honesty that transcends the human mind. It's an honesty, a truth that can only come from God, that just brings you to a place where you just recognize that there is a living God, and who is righteous and sinless, holy, perfect, and that I am just utterly sinful before this holy, righteous, perfect God. And that furthermore, there's a price to pay for that for my sins. And this is part of that. Like I said, it's almost an internal comprehension that transcends even the ability to fully comprehend with the mind. But that I knew, A, my utter sinfulness, B, a holy and righteous God. And also in that same milieu of revelation that comes from God, that God did send his son, Jesus Christ, to die on a cross, to pay the price for my sins. Because, as the Apostle Paul said, the wages of sin is death. And the wages of sin, the consequences of sin must be death. And Jesus paid my price. And for any whom God sovereignly gives faith to believe, like he did to Paul on the road to Damascus, anyone that the Lord gives faith to believe in the Son, Jesus Christ, dying on the Son for the forgiveness of sins, it's a sovereign work of God. But as I was getting back to saying, it does feel in the moment that also my will is playing into that, because it does feel in the moment like, it's like crossing the Rubicon, if you know Roman history, that, it's a line that you could just never cross. And, but in that moment you do cross by the working of God. But at the same time, in that moment, there is a realm of real, true, genuine, bona fide repentance, a changing of the mind. I used to view the world this way, and everything that I thought and did was manifested out of this view of the world that I had always had. And suddenly, in a moment, my view of the world shifted. And there is a sense in this comprehension of this thing God is doing that's almost impossible to fully put into words. There's a sense in that moment that there's also a working of your will, a cooperation of your will that is not absent the human will. And that's why it's called in the Bible the baptism of, this is the near purpose of God's salvation plan, the baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And baptisma is the word. Baptisma, it's a noun. It's a word that means the fact of, not an action event like the verb baptism, to baptize. Baptisma is a certain type of Greek noun that it infers it's the fact of a baptism. It's a thing. It exists. And it's called the baptisma of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. It's almost as if it's a thing that that you grab, you possess. It's from God. It's by God's grace. And there's a cooperation in there, but that cooperation that's part of this comprehension that's hard to explain is enabled and empowered by God, because it wouldn't happen without the working of God. I hope that this makes a little bit of sense. This is the salvation plan of God, the way it's revealed to us in the scriptures, and the way that many genuine redeemed children of God can relate to. It was put to me that, well, what about someone just became a believer so young that they can't relate to an experience like that? And I say, amen, that we should all be so fortunate, because it's kind of a heart-wrenching experience to go through a midlife crisis event to bring that baptism, that baptisma of repentance, that thing that Paul experienced on the road to Damascus. And anyone who receives redemption from God, whether you're a 3-year-old child that just, for whatever reason, God in his grace allows to receive, maybe because they grew up under Christian parents, who knows, there are 1,000 different reasons that it can happen. Every redemption is a unique event, unique to the individual, both in time and their age and their experience where they're at, whether you're a 3-year-old child or a 48-year-old man or anything in between or after or before, whatever. It's the power of God, the working of God, the grace of God that allows that to happen. And this corrupt idea of universal atonement, that, well, God put his son on the cross and now all humanity has grace available to them. It's completely, totally, 100% dependent on their strength of their will to choose to become a follower of God. And that is wrong. That is corrupt theology. It's one of the reasons why we get a lot of fake Christians that fall away so quickly, because the mission, the idea is to get out of somebody a confession. And there may be many reasons why somebody wants to confess, to become part of a community, to get something, to satisfy the ones that are soliciting or eliciting a confession of faith. There are a lot of reasons that can happen, but the bottom line is this, that God works first. And this is post-cross, after the cross. Paul's an exemplar for this, that the Lord works sovereignly to bring the children of God into faith. And it's through his sovereign working that they are enabled to make their decision for Christ. This is the salvation plan of God. This is Pauline theology. This is the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels. The one exception is the book of James, church. The one exception. Jewish theology says that God's salvation plan is merited. God's salvation plan it does start with God's grace to establish a covenant people of God. He did that for the Israelites through Moses as the mediator. He gave Moses Torah, and Torah is the basis of covenant between God and the Israelite people. Torah was always intended to be a light shining on the sins of the Israelites, so that the Israelites, through the temple sacrifices, atoning for sins on a daily basis, day after day after day, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, every day, sacrificing animals to atone for the sins of the people. Why? Because the law will only shine a light on sins. That's all the law will do. That's all the law was ever intended to do. That's all God ever purposed in the law, that the law would shine a light on sins and cause his people to long for the Messiah, that the Messiah would be the victor, the Messiah would be the solution to the sin problem that the temple sacrifice, liturgy, and worship cult of the Jews could never accomplish. Could atone for sins under the old covenant, under the law, through the daily animal sacrifices, but could never solve the sin problem. Well, what happened? What happened is what always happened. It's what happened in the garden when God gave one commandment: don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what happened? The serpent showed up and said, what did the serpent say to the woman? You will not surely die if you eat from this tree. Rather, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God. And that's been the problem of mankind ever since the fall, is that man wants to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I want to decide for myself what's right and wrong, what's good and evil, what is what I like and what I don't like. I will be the judge of that. And it's been that way for broken humanity through all of history ever since the fall, that man eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that just simply means that we've turned our backs on God, on the tree of life, on truth, on righteous judgment of what is good and evil, what's right and wrong, what's righteous and unrighteous. We've turned our back on it, and we just want to decide for ourselves. That was a deception of Satan. And that church, that's exactly what happened to the ancient Israelites. And you can read about that in, if you want New Testament scriptures that testify to that, you can read the prophets. The Old Testament prophets are just replete with that message. But in the New Testament, you have Stephen in Acts 7:53, in the speech of Stephen before the Sanhedrin, right before they stoned him. In 7:53 talks about the angels that redirected the law. And Paul makes reference to that very same thing in Galatians 3:19, that the angels of the mediator, who would be Satan, a lot of bad interpretation of Galatians 3:9, but Paul is talking about the same thing. The deception that happened very early, that took the law of Moses that was given to Moses, and through the deception of the demonic realm, they flipped it upside down. And rather than allowing the law of God to be a light shining on sins and cause the people of God to long for their Messiah, who would be God's solution to the sin problem, rather than that, they flipped it upside down and said, well, if God has given Moses the law, the 10 Commandments, then he must expect that we are able to do those 10 commandments, and that in doing those 10 commandments, righteousness, salvation will be ascribed to us. It's a merited form of salvation. It's corrupt. It's Paul would call a doctrine of demons. Doctrines of demons always work that way. They're always bent on, focused on taking God's truth, what God gives to mankind, and flipping it and turning it right around. He did that in the Garden of Eden with the two trees, where God said, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What's the other one? The tree of life. The inference being, stick to the tree of life, Adam. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the only commandment I'm going to give you. There is no other. Paul refers to that in Romans, at the end of Romans, calls it the righteous commandment of God, the one righteous commandment of God, which goes all the way back to the garden, the one righteous commandment of God. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the one that got violated. And through Jesus now, we have restored access. Those of us who have been given faith to believe as a sovereign work of God, we have access again to the tree of life. Who is the tree of life? Is Jesus Christ. But as I started in the beginning, there must be death for sins. But that is the real issue that we're dealing with here in the letter from James, and the real distinction between Paul and James in their view, their theology of the salvation plan of God under the new covenant. For Paul, there is only Jesus. For Paul, there is a restored, and that's why in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, there is a restored understanding of Moses. And 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is so explicit that it's amazing that the understanding of God's salvation plan under the new covenant is not better understood and better taught in the churches in comparison to what James is doing and what James is teaching. Paul is saying that there is a taking away, a removal of the veil of Moses. And that just simply means that the deception that the Israelites have been under since the beginning, that they can do the law, they can attain to the righteousness of God, that they can attain to their own salvation by obedience to Moses, by doing works of the law. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 takes that idea and dispenses with this. It says, no, faith from the Lord in the near purpose of God's salvation plan is the removal of the veil, that we can see that how deceitful that lie from Satan was, that we could ever presume to do works of the law and rack up credits to our favor, so that at the last day, at the last judgment, we would have credits, we would have works to our credit that would offset our sins and would then result in our salvation. They call it the salvation of the soul. And the taking away of the veil of Moses is that, no, that was always a deception. That was always a lie. That was never true. We were never able to attain to the righteousness of God. Read, Romans chapter 9, the end of Romans chapter 9, where Paul is so explicit that the Jews had always tried to attain to their own righteousness by doing works, and it was always a deception. It was always false. It was never possible. But the veil of deception remained and remains on the eyes of the Jews who have Torah, and they believe that doing Torah is their righteousness that is going to attain their salvation in the last day. And this is what happened to the Christian faith community in Jerusalem very early. They originally, with the cross and the empty grave, had the full gospel and were practicing and walking in the full gospel, the same gospel that you read about in the Gospels, and the same gospel that Paul writes about in his letters. They were practicing that, walking in that in the church in the earliest years. But with the, it didn't take very long with the progression, the evolution in Jerusalem, that the faith became syncretized with Judaism. And a sect of the Pharisees, believers from the sect of the Pharisees, became teachers in the Christian community, passionate for Moses, passionate for the law of Moses. And that's how you could end up with teaching, as Luke writes about at the beginning of Acts, that men from Jerusalem came to Antioch teaching that unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And of course, if you have the circumcision as the physical mark on the body, it's a sign that says you keep all of the law of Moses. It's not just simply a removal of the foreskin, that then you're good and you can go off and be a good Christian now. No, the circumcision of the flesh is a statement of allegiance to the entire law of Moses. Circumcision is a sign of, for a Gentile or a Jew, it's a sign of a full proselyte. Well, a Jew doesn't proselytize, a Gentile proselytizes into Judaism. But circumcision in the flesh is full proselytization into the Jewish religion and Jewish community, that you are now under Torah covenant with God, and you stay in Torah covenant with God by doing works of the law. That's Judaism. And in Judaism, it's those works of the law that rack up to your credit on your ledger that you'll take before the Lord on the last day at the final judgment, every human being in Jewish theology. And I think Paul affirms this too, that we will all be accountable for everything we said or did on the last day at the judgment. The only difference being that some, those who are the redeemed belonging to Jesus Christ, have had their penalty paid, the penalty of death as the wages of sin paid for by Jesus Christ. That's the difference. In sound Christian doctrine, in Pauline theology, in the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels. But the letter of James in the New Testament uniquely affirms and upholds Jewish religion, that it is works of the law. It is Moses that saves. Works of the law racking up to your credit to offset your sins, so that in the eschatological last day judgment, because of your works of the law, hopefully you'll have enough of them that your soul will be saved. Hopefully. You don't know until you get there. That's Jewish theology. That's the letter from James. That is his theme throughout the letter. It's a fascinating letter. It's been a great journey for me. I hope it has been for you too. It's been a wonderful journey just to go through the letter from James, line by line, almost word by word, phrase by phrase. Not quite, but almost. I've done that in my commentary, but that's just too much to do here in a verbal teaching. But we've pretty much gone through the letter from James, line by line, verse by verse, and in some cases, phrase by phrase. From verse 1:1, where he his opening salutation to the 12 tribes in the diaspora. It's a letter to the Jews. and all the way to the ending here that we're now into, starting today. It'll be a two-part ending called the final exhortation. And there are two parts in this. It's an amazing, vastly misunderstood closing to the letter of James. James is closing his letter in perfect harmony with his entire letter. He does in the final closing exhortation here what he's been doing all through his entire letter. And those of you that have been with me know that James goes alternating between what we've called discontinuity passages and continuity passages. Discontinuity is where he is chastising the Pauline mission for teaching discontinuity with Moses, where Paul's going into the synagogues and into the Gentile nations and teaching to, in James' words, to forsake Moses. Paul was actually just teaching that Jesus Christ, as he said in Romans 10:4, Christ is the end of the law in all those believing, to the Jew first and also to the Gentiles. Christ is the telos, the end of the law. And what part of that the church doesn't get has been a little bit baffling to me, but maybe not so much when you really think about it more deeply. People, human beings, have a real problem. They have a real difficult time accepting grace. Try taking someone out to dinner once or twice, and you'll find out how uncomfortable that is for people. They don't want to feel like they owe anything. I don't want to, this is the human mindset, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I don't want to feel beholden to God. I want to do something to earn my salvation. God, let me do something. Let me go around doing good deeds all day long, every day for my entire life, so that when I get to the judgment seat, you can look at me and say, oh, look how good you've been for your whole life. Look how many good deeds you've done. Far outweighs the sins that you've done. Come on in. You're saved. You're welcome into heaven. Here, the gates are open for you because you've done so much good in your life that you, whoever you are, deserve your salvation. That's the human problem. Human beings want to feel like they deserve what they get, that they've worked for what they get. And of course, you know, it works that way in the world here. That's the way, pretty much that's the way the world works. Every once in a while, there may be an act of grace for something that you didn't earn or deserve. And that's great when it happens. Take it, you know, and say thank you, be grateful for it. But the world doesn't really work that way. The world really does work in a manner that you earn the things that are on your table. That being said, we could have a really good teaching that God ultimately is the one who is behind the good things that you have in life, the food you have, the shelter, the clothes on your back, that God is the ultimate source of those good things. But we live in a broken, fallen world. And when Adam abdicated the tree of life, what did God say to Adam? You're going to earn your living moving forward by the sweat of your brow. That's how it's going to work, Adam. So if you want the good things in life, you want a house over your head, you're going to have to build it. You want food on your table, you got to go plant a field and harvest it and keep all the weeds out for 5 or 6 months. God would say, I'll send the rain, but you're going to have to do all that. It's going to be by the sweat on your brow that you're going to put food on the table. And the same with the clothes that you wear. You're going to have to work at it. But don't ever lose sight of the fact that God himself is the source, ultimate source of the good things that we have in life. But in this broken, fallen world, we have to work really hard to have those things to sustain us. God is the ultimate source, though. Anyway, back to the Jewish pattern of religion that is replete in the letter from James. It's works of the law, Torah, it's obedience to Torah, continuous, day after day after day, year after year, that are going to attain to your salvation at the final judgment. That's the letter from James. That is fundamentally different than, fundamentally at odds with the grace-centered, Jesus-centered theology and salvation plan that Paul teaches, that Paul was taking to the nations, that Paul would go into the diaspora synagogues and teach to the Jews. So that James, when Paul came back 10 years after the writing of James, Paul came back to Jerusalem after writing Romans in AD 47, carrying the offering from the Gentiles in Macedonia and Greece, bringing the offering back to the church in Jerusalem. Basically, the only thing James had to say to Paul was, well, we're hearing, Paul, that you're teaching the Jews in the diaspora to forsake Moses. And you're teaching the men in the diaspora not to circumcise their young boys on their 8th day, their young baby boys on the 8th day. We're hearing that you're teaching that, Paul. He says, you see here in Jerusalem how many thousands there are who are passionate, who are zealous for Moses, don't you? You notice James doesn't say that are passionate for Jesus. No, read it, church. Acts chapter 21, verses 20 and 21. Read it. Put your eyes on it. James, the brother of the Lord, who wrote this letter 10 years after he wrote it, says to Paul when Paul comes to Jerusalem, not, hey, Paul, you see how passionate we are for Jesus, don't you? No, that's not what James says. He says, Paul, you see how passionate we are for Moses. So you, Paul, who are teaching your brothers in the diaspora, your fellow kinsmen according to the flesh, teaching them to forsake Moses, you, Paul, go to the temple and undergo purification because you are filthy, dirty, and impure because you have forsaken Moses. And if you're going to be in community here in Jerusalem with us, your fellow Christians, you're going to have to be in good stead with Moses. So go to the temple and undergo purification. Of course, you know the rest of the story. Most of you do. The riot and the beginning of Paul's prison term, and spent 2 years in prison in Caesarea, and then he would be transported in that fateful boat trip to Rome, and he would spend 2 years in captivity in Rome. And then Luke doesn't tell us what happened at the end of that 2 years. But I think the reason Luke doesn't tell us is because Paul was beheaded. Paul was martyred in Rome in AD 62 at the end of his prison ministry. My point here is the letter from James. There's so much evidence in the New Testament about this church. The letter from James is thematic. Keep Moses, follow Moses, because that is the basis for the salvation of the soul. Whether you're a Christian or not, Moses is the basis of the salvation of the soul, teaches James. And that's what the final salutation puts an exclamation point on. So with that, Robin, let's read I'm going to read the entire final exhortation. It's verses 17 through 20. It's 2 passages. I'm going to teach on the first one today, but I want to read the whole final exhortation so you get the whole thing in one chunk and know that I'm going to teach on the first part today. I'll teach on the second part next week. But it's in the second part that you hear the real essence of Jewish religion and the real essence of James' attachment to Jewish religion, to Moses as the basis of salvation. Okay, let me get my text. Is it up, Robin?
Sorry.
Okay, final exhortation, starting at chapter 5, verse 17. I call the passage final exhortation. The first subpassage, reprimand. This is going to surprise a lot of people. Stay with me. It's fascinating. Reprimand against discontinuity. Reprimand against the idea that Moses under the new covenant is over, is finished, discontinuity. James reprimands that. We're going to talk about that today. Verse 17. Elijah was an anthroman, of like nature with us. This is James writing here, of like nature with us. And by a prayer, he prayed for it not to rain, and it did not rain upon the earth for 3 years and 6 months. And again, he prayed, and heaven gave rain, and the earth sprouted forth its fruit. That's part A. Now, James has just completed his passage, previous passage, verses 13 through 16, where he basically outlined, and we've talked about that in the previous 2 teachings, he outlined the prayer practices of the church at Jerusalem. Fascinating in itself. Not going to go over it again here. Worth listening to again a second time if you've only listened once. If you've never listened to those teaching, oh my gosh, you're going to miss a lot of what's going on here in this final exhortation with this reference to the prayers of Elijah. So, first one that we're going to talk about today, verses 17 and 18. Next week, we'll talk about this last subpassage that I've titled Commendation for Continuity. In other words, a commendation, a letter of commendation for those who hold to continuity with Moses into the age of faith in the Messiah, the new covenant. Continuity, commendation. He gives a commendation for that. Verse 19, starts, kind of keys it right here, starts, my brothers. Notice he didn't say that in the previous passage. He starts this final subpassage at verse 19 with my brothers. My brothers, if ever anyone among you might be led astray away from the truth and someone might turn him back, let him know that the one turning back a sinner from his wandering way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. Remember, it's works of the law that cover sins. He is talking according, yes, thank you, Rob. I have to keep saying this over and over again. According to James, not Paul. It's works of the law that would cover a multitude of sins. That's Jamesian theology, not Pauline theology. Got to keep saying that because you're really, I know that I'm coming up against here with a lot of you with this very deeply ingrained psychological imprint. They call that in the world of psychology. They call it a psychological imprint, that you subconsciously have a grid, a screen through which everything is interpreted, whether you consciously are thinking about that or not. You have a psychological imprint that just works all by itself. And that imprint is very difficult almost in terms of human strength, almost impossible to overcome. I'll go so far as to say it almost takes a divine act of God to make an alteration in that psychological imprint. And it's normally going to come with a very difficult experience. You normally are not going to alter the psychological imprint of your mind when everything's great and things are going good. In fact, that's almost a confirmation that you've got the right way of looking at things. It normally is going to be a crisis that might make a chink in that subconscious psychological grid. So that is, I realize what I'm coming up against with people that have been taught in the church for their entire life that in some cases that, well, no, James here is teaching that salvation is fleeting. You better be very careful. You better be on your best behavior because you could lose your salvation. Yeah, God saves. Yes, it's grace, but if you're not a good boy or girl, you could sin so bad that you'll lose your salvation. Bad teaching, bad theology. That is not what Paul teaches. That is not what you would find in the Gospels, but that is an interpretation that you could draw out of the letter from James. Why? Because in the letter from James, if you forsake Moses, you are forsaking your means of salvation. And that's what's happening here. So Paul writes in Galatians chapter 2, that chapter 2, verse 12, that certain men from James, those from the circumcision, came to Antioch and confronted the church at Antioch, confronted Paul and the Gentile believers and Peter and Barnabas, certain men from James, those from the circumcision. That simply means those who kept Moses, those who were obedient to Moses. You can read that in Acts chapter 15, verse 5, that there were believers from the sect of the Pharisees that were demanding that the Gentile believers should be circumcised as their demonstration of obedience to the law of Moses. You really should read that, church, and read it to the point where you're very conversant with it, because it's important to know that that's the competition, that's the struggle, that's the conflict that existed in the early church that Paul's writing about in Galatians and that Luke is recording in chapter 15. It's that confrontation at Antioch that was the precursor, the spark for going and having the Jerusalem Council meeting of AD 49, which we might talk about a little bit next week. There's a really important dimension to that council meeting in AD 49 that relates to this first letter of James. Right? The second letter came out from that meeting. So the point being here, this final passage that I'm going to teach on next week is a commendation to those that counter mission from Jerusalem that was coming out from Jerusalem, certain men from James, men from Judea, Luke would write in Acts 51, men from Judea came to Antioch teaching the Gentiles, unless you're circumcised according to the customs of Moses, you cannot be saved. Unless you are keeping Moses, you cannot be saved. Let me give you the corollary to that. Moses is the means of your salvation. Teach these men from James, those from the circumcision, men from Jerusalem, Judea, that were coming to Antioch in AD 48, challenging Paul and his teaching. Men from James. Unless you're circumcised according to the customs of Moses, you cannot be saved, said these men from the circumcision. These men that are passionate and allegiant to Moses. You don't hear a lot of talk about Jesus Christ in there. That's the commendation that James closes his letter on. It's Paul referenced in chapter 3 of 2 Corinthians. He asked, do I come to you with letters of commendation? He said, no, you're a letter of our commendation, written by the Spirit on the heart. We don't need letters written on paper with ink. But this letter from James for these men from the circumcision was a letter of commendation. It was a letter supporting their mission against Paul. And James finishes his letter commending this counter mission. My brothers, if ever any, and my brothers being the Jewish Christians in the synagogue communities of the diaspora. Get that right at verse 1:1. So here at the end, my brothers, if ever any among you might be led astray away from the truth, Torah, when someone might turn him back, let him know that the one turning back a sinner from his wandering way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. Brothers, if you will turn back those whom Paul has deceived, who are forsaking Moses, if you'll turn him back and he will reestablish, right, through purification rites at the temple, reestablish his allegiance to Moses, you are saving his soul from death. By the way, that's a really good work that's going to cover a multitude of your own sins at the eschatological judgment. It'll rack up to your credit. So you should be highly motivated to do that, writes Paul here at the very end of the letter. He's commending this counter mission. All right. Long introduction. Let's start with our teaching. So we're back at the first passage of the final exhortation. Let me read it quickly. Verse 17 on prayer, following the summary of the prayer practices at Jerusalem in verses 13 to 16. Then in verse 17, Elijah was an anthroman of like nature with us, and by prayer he prayed for it not to rain, and it did not rain upon the earth for 3 years and 6 months. And again, verse 18, and again he prayed, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth sprouted forth its fruit. A lot of things should ring in your ears from previous in the letter of James. I'm going to do a little bit of reading here because in this, I want to be sure that you get the full meal deal of what's happening in this passage here, and that I, with my fallible mind here, leave a lot on the table that doesn't get said. And I want to try and avoid that here in these final teachings. So let me read from my commentary. I have two, what I call expositions that I've written that are really unique elaborations on the scripture that in themselves can be teachings in and of themselves, even separate from unpacking the meaning in this passage of James. They would be really good teachings in and of themselves, but they're very germane to these two verses. One I've titled The Provenance of James, the origin of James. What was his setting and purpose and milieu, what was going on that caused him or motivated him to write his letter. And then the second one, specifically on reprimand and commendation. What is James doing here in these final two passages? I want to read these, and then we'll talk through the two verses. I don't think having read these expositions, I don't think that'll take long, but I want you to put your listening ears on. I'm going to try and read clearly and slow enough that you can follow verbally. And also, and I highly recommend this, it would be worthwhile taking notes. Stop the tape. If you're listening to a recording, stop the recording and write things down. When I say something that's memorable that you want to make sure that you don't forget, like we all do, write it down. It's one of the best ways to learn something is to listen very closely and take notes. Very powerful learning mechanism. So here at verse 17, this is an obscure, I'm reading my introductory comment, and then I'm going to read the exposition. This is an obscure and enigmatic reference to Elijah using a combination of two Greek words, anthropos and homoipathes, meaning anthroman and likeness of nature. Very unique reference here. Enigmatic, so like, what the heck is James doing here? What does that mean? An anthroman with a nature like ours. That should be the question that would be sparked from this when you read it. The rhetorical meaning and purpose, which is not readily understood. And it was not supposed to be. The question becomes this: what motivated James to refer to Elijah, the revered prophet, in this way? For the answer, we're going to read in the exposition here just ahead. So in verses 1, way back at the beginning, in verses 1, 7 through 8, and in verses 1, 19 through 20, Paul juxtaposed those two terms, anthropos and aner, anthroman and andreman. We've taught about this a lot. It's worth repeating. At some point, I would like for you to be conversant with those two words so that when somebody uses one of them, you say, oh, yeah, in New Testament vernacular, anthropos or anthropos and aner are two words for man that have very different vernacular meanings. Anthropos is normally a meaning for a man generally, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. It's just a meaning for a biological man, anthropos. Andreman, aner, andreman, I call it Andre because that's the root that the word aner comes from, Andre. And it says the name Andrew comes from this word, by the way. Andreman is different than anthropos. Anthropos, general word for men, regardless of ethnicity. If you're a human being of any ethnic culture, you could be called an anthropos. And sometimes anthropos is used even to refer to all of humanity. The word aner, andreman, that I transliterate into English in Stauros, the Wooden Bible, I call andreman, always infers a blessing. It's the word that gets used in Greek for husband. If you're a man and you have a wife, you're an andreman, you're an aner, and that is the word actually for husband in the Greek. And why? Because the idea is you're a husband, you have a wife, you are blessed. You have a wife, you're going to have a family, and that's one of the greatest blessings to have in life. So when you become a husband with a wife and can begin to bear and raise a family and have that kind of a legacy to your name, it is one of the greatest blessings from God. And so an anthropos man who has a wife is called an aner, a blessed man. Well, andreman, aner, is also used for Israelites. As when they refer to an Israelite as a man, they use in the Greek translations or in the Greek language, they use the word aner to refer it, regardless of whether you have a wife or not. If you're an Israelite man under the law, you are an aner, an andreman. You're blessed because you are in covenant with God. And so you're called an aner, an andreman. So it immediately stands out here that James uses the term anthropos, the general term for man, to speak about Elijah, anthropos with a like nature to us, the Jews. Elijah was an anthroman with a like nature to us. catch the attention there. What is he doing? Why is he doing that? So let's read the exposition. You don't have to put anything up, Robin. If you want, you can put up the first passage there and let them see that on the screen while I read this. They know. Okay. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to read the exposition here. Provenance of James. At the end of his letter in James 5:17, James refers to the prophet Elijah as an anthroman of like nature with us. Understanding this reference as an alternative to andreman, as the blessed Jew, there have been many discussions about. I just discussed that with you. So James is calling Elijah an anthroman with a like nature of us, Jews. That's simply a way of saying Elijah was an andreman, blessed of God, in covenant with God, like us, and all the things, like all the psychological imprint that goes with that, like nature of us. There remains an important and enigmatic correlation to James' combination of these two words that's not so readily apparent. What is James doing? What motivated James to make such an obscure reference to Elijah as a man, an anthroman with a like nature with us? Why would he do that? Since the three pertinent parties in James' reference are one, Israelites, or James himself; two, James' addressees, the 12 dispersed tribes, who are Jews, Jewish Christians; and three, the prophet Elijah. So it would be expected that James would have referred to these parties by the vernacular reference Andreman, blessed Andreman. But he didn't do the expected thing here. And so the reader is drawn by James to inquire further. What is James getting at by calling Elijah an anthroman of like nature with us? And what do the prayers of Elijah have to do with this obscure reference? Indeed, James' rhetorical purpose with the combination of anthropos and hamoipathes, in other words, anthroman and like nature, is part and parcel to the enigmatic rebuke contained in this passage, James 5:17-18. Wherefore the prayers of Elijah for drought in James 5:17, and then rain in James 5:18, form an inclusio around the historic story of Elijah the prophet of God versus the false prophets of Baal. So we're going to read about this further in the next exposition, but let me go on with the current one here. In the notes that we'll be talking today in the discussion, the teaching for James 5:17, to know James' motivation and rhetorical purpose for referring to Elijah as anthropos and hamoipathes, an anthroman of like nature with us, we must turn to the writings of Luke. This is an intertextual correlation here. And the single other New Testament use of the adjective hamoipathes, of like nature. It's only used one other place in the New Testament, and that's in the writings of Luke. And guess what, church? It's on the lips of Paul in South Galatia, in the confrontation, that the riot that occurred with the Jews at Lystra only months before the writing of the letter from James. That's what's going on here. So Luke, who likely wrote in the early 60s, which would be about a dozen years after James wrote, places the word on the lips of Paul while he was ministering in South Galatia in AD 47. And here's what he puts on the lips of Paul, speaking to the men of Lystra, who were attempting to deify him and Barnabas. And Paul is up in arms and saying, no, we're not going there. He says to them, we are anthromen of like nature with you, using the same words that James used here about Elijah in talking about the prayers of Elijah, which is invoking the prophets of Baal. Keep all this in view, church. This is only months before James would use a very similar construction in his letter written in AD 48, which itself was a response to the Jewish uproar created in South Galatia by Paul's ministry there. James writes, Elijah was a man of like nature with us. Almost exactly the same word, exactly the same words that Paul used, speaking to the men at Lystra that were attempting to deify him and Barnabas. So 7 sequential observations are important. I'm going to make 7 observations relative to Paul's harried reference in Lystra, which leads ultimately to James' enigmatic reprimand against Paul and his apostolic ministry to the Gentiles. First, given the casual use here in James' letter to the 12 tribes in the diaspora, it may be presumed that the term, an anthromen of like nature, was a common term in first century Judaism to compare human nature between peoples, because that's what the Jews did. They were always comparing themselves to other peoples. And so the term anthromen with like nature of us was probably part of the vernacular of the Jews in dealing with this issue, that we're a different people. We're a consecrated people, set apart from the world. We're of a different nature than the Gentiles. We are anthromen of a different nature. That's what makes us andre men. So to compare human nature between peoples, especially between Jews and the Gentiles, likely it was frequently used and widely understood in this manner by the Jews. Greek was the lingua franca, it was called. Greek was the language of commerce. Greek was the language commonly spoken throughout the Orient, if you call it the Eastern Mediterranean. Greek was the primary language. So this phrase in Greek would have likely been very commonly, very vernacular, recognized among the Jews. Number 2, second, given the hysteria of the moment in Lystra, right, when Paul and Barnabas are fending off this attempt to deify them as Zeus and Apollo because of a healing that Paul had done, and they've got to put that down immediately, and they do. Given the hysteria of the moment at Lystra, and you read about that in Acts 14, as the pagans in Lystra were attempting to deify Paul and Barnabas, Paul was contemplating the difference in nature, not between Jews and Gentiles, but between God and men generally, right? They were trying to deify him. So Paul was distinguishing between God and men. Man, we're not gods. We're of like nature with you. That was what Paul was doing. But he was drawing on his Jewish vernacular here to make that point to them. His unorthodox use of this Jewish vernacular term was not part of a well-prepared response, but a frantic appeal out of his psychological imprint, out of this subconscious well of habit. We all do that, right? Especially when we get into a crisis. We just react instinctively. And that's what Paul did here. Luke amply describes the scene and Paul's words, quote, but hearing them, this is Paul and Barnabas hearing the men of Lystra trying to deify them, but hearing them, the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying and saying, Andre men, Why do you do these things? And they said, we are anthromen, of like nature with you. That's in Acts 14, chapter 14, verses 14 and 15, part A. Considering Luke's narrative account of the riot in Lystra, the reader readily perceives the double infraction in Paul's words relative to Jewish vernacular, which the diaspora Jews of South Galatia who witnessed the whole affair would have immediately taken exception to. Had Paul, in other words, the Jews that are standing around watching this whole thing happen, would have heard Paul's words to them, and their ears would have been immediately pricked. They would start looking at each other and say, do you know what Paul just said? Paul just called those Gentiles men of like nature with him and Barnabas. They're Jews. He's speaking to Gentiles. Did you hear that? This is in the text, church. If you read it and understand it rightly, especially when it comes out again in James' letter. Had Paul the luxury of time, he certainly would have chosen different terminology in the presence of his kinsmen according to the flesh. Item number 3. It may be equally presumed then that Paul, being a Jew, addressing these Gentile pagans as andremen, right? Gentile pagans who are trying to deify him, and Barnabas calls them andremen, the word reserved for Israelites in covenant with God, calls them andremen, and attributing to them a like nature to that of himself and Barnabas, whom these pagans were attempting to deify as gods after Paul healed a lame man. This was the predicate cause. This is why the Jews from Antioch and Iconium responded immediately to Paul's remarks. Stoning him and dragging his body outside the city gate of Lystra, leaving him for dead. Acts chapter 14, verse 19. These Jews would have been fuming amongst themselves as how dare this Jew compare such vile pagan behavior to Jewish nature? How dare he do that? You hear what's happening here? Paul's trying to put down their attempt to deify him, and the Jews are over here just rendering judgment, parsing everything Paul said in that tense moment. They weren't recognizing, well, he's rebuking these Gentiles for trying to deify them. Yay, Paul. That's exactly what a good Jew should do. Thank you, Paul, for doing that. No. They want to pick apart the words that he's using while he's putting them down, out of context, and then use that as their premise to stone him to death, which they did immediately. They stoned him and left him for dead outside the city gates. Item number 4. Fourth, as Paul was frantically correcting the Gentiles at Lystra, who had attempted to deify himself and Barnabas, he also said to them, this is part of the comment that he said to them, and yet he, the living God, did not leave himself without witness, giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. This reference to rains from heaven as God's blessing upon unrighteous Gentiles is confirmation of the intertextual correlation of James 5:17 and 18, right? The passage we're talking about here today, and the passage that Luke wrote in Acts chapter 14, verses 15 through 17. Wherefore, for what reason James, it's his literary purpose, correlates Paul with the prophets of Baal. James is seizing on these words of Paul that he heard, right? Because the Jews came racing up to Jerusalem, or down to Jerusalem, up to Jerusalem. Well, in their vernacular, it'd be up to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's heavenly. You always go up to Jerusalem and go down everywhere else. So the Jews at Lystra, having presumed to have killed Paul, stoned him to death, would know they're in big trouble with the Roman authorities. They'll go seek help. But James, these words and these correlations are showing up in James' letter only months later. This idea of man being of like nature shows up in this passage. And the idea of rains from God shows up in this passage. The correlation with the encounter Paul had at Lystra only months before is unmistakable. It's not like you say, well, maybe. No, church. That's not how correlations like this work. This is stark, raving evidence that James is echoing the riot at Lystra and the words used by Paul. And he's echoing that here so that this correlation with the prophets of Baal can be understood as a rebuke, a reprimand on Paul and his teaching ministry. So number 5, in the conclusion to Paul's frantic appeal at Lystra, part B of verse 14, Acts chapter 14, verse 15, part B, he concludes with, I'll give you the first part again. Andremen, why do you do these things? And why are we are anthromen of like nature with you? And then part B of verse 15, evangelizing you to turn away from these worthless things. So here's the point I want to make here. In there is the word Matthias. It's an adjective, means worthless. Paul uses it referring to worthless thing. The idolatry of the Gentiles is Matthias, worthless. They're worthless things, Paul wrote. Well, guess what? This word shows up in the letter from James also. Not coincidentally, James used the same adjective in James 1:26, all the way back in the first chapter. If anyone thinks himself to be religious, and he's got Paul in his lenses here. If anyone thinks himself to be religious, yet not bridling his tongue, the issue is teaching, but rather deceiving his heart, the religion of this one is Matthias, worthless, writes James, only months after this riot in Lystra, where Paul used the same adjective to rebuke the Gentiles that were attempting to deify him. And Barnabas shows up in the letter from James. Very rare word. It's not like, well, that word shows up hundreds of times. No, this is a very rare word. So it's very telling, very unusual that it shows up here again only months after it was used by Paul, shows up here in the letter from James. So James, having the Apostle Paul in mind as his anonymous antagonist, thusly saying that the supposed religion Paul was teaching to the diaspora Jews and Gentiles violates the Mosaic religion of the Jews and was leading innocent Jews astray away from obedience to Torah. That's James' use of the word Matthias in James 1:26. And so, in the spirit of the ancient Hebrew exegetical rule of Gezerah Shavah, meaning words like this are used to interpret each other. If you want to know fully what James is doing in James 1:26, look at what Luke did with the word in chapter 14 with this encounter on the lips of Paul and this encounter with the Gentiles that were attempting to deify him. Gezerah Shavah says these two words in those two separate locations can be used to help you understand both locations, especially the more enigmatic one. It's pretty obvious, the one on Paul's lips in Lystra, rebuking the Gentile men who were attempting to deify him and Barnabas. Pretty obvious what the word's doing there. It's not so obvious that James has Paul in his sights in James 1:26. But when you see this correlation, this intertextuality, you can know that James wrote this only months after the encounter at Lystra. This is evidence that he has Paul in his sights. And so in the spirit of Gezerah Shavah, insofar as the remarkable intertextual correlation described here, by strategically placing the adjective Matthias on the lips of Paul, Luke is layering onto his own literary purpose to expose James' enigmatic literary purpose with the prayers of Elijah in James 5:17-18. Luke, writing a dozen years later, records what Paul said in Lystra in order to bring light, shed much light on what James is doing, what his literary purpose was in his letter. That's what Luke is doing. In other words, this use of the adjective Matthias is hardly an isolated coincidence, but rather is now part of Luke's well-orchestrated literary pattern to provide his readers with an enormous insight into the very genesis of the controversy that would ultimately culminate in the beheading of Paul at Rome in AD 62, which is likely the occasion on which Luke embarks to write the book of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles. Okay, item number 6. Given that the diaspora Jews of South Galatia had exercised immediate vigilante capital justice upon a fellow Jew, Paul, they also would have immediately appealed to Jerusalem so that the high priest might affirm their action. The risk is that they themselves might fall victim to Roman law, which held that only a Roman governor had authority to exercise capital punishment. See, by the Jews stoning Paul to death, or thinking that they had stoned him to death on leaving him for dead at Lystra, they actually usurped the authority of the Roman governor, which is a pretty serious thing in the Roman Empire. You don't do that. That is, there'll be an immediate death penalty for that. And these Jews who stoned Paul would know that. And so they're going to seek cover for themselves from their authority, who had relations with the Roman governance, the chief priests at Jerusalem, who, by the way, were appointed by the Roman governor in Judea. The risk is that these Jews themselves might fall victim to Roman law, which held only a Roman governor had authority to exercise capital punishment. This risk needed to be mitigated quickly. So indeed, under these circumstances, news of the event in Lystra likely made its way to Jerusalem by the quickest means possible. So even under optimal conditions, this journey from Lystra to Jerusalem was about 440 miles by land, which would take probably something on the order, even under good circumstances, probably about a month for news of what happened to finally make it to Jerusalem. So item number 7. Seventh and finally, the personal appeal of these diaspora Jews to the high priest at Jerusalem would certainly have resulted in a summons to James, the brother of the Lord. He was the primary, reputed pillar of the church in Jerusalem. The primary leader of the church in Jerusalem was James. And so the chief priests would have summoned James to appear before them and the Sanhedrin, the council of Jewish leaders at Jerusalem. This becomes a very plausible scenario that motivates, or to motivate, James' rather hasty letter written in AD 48, which would then quickly find its way to Antioch, which by then was where Paul was. Paul had returned and went to Antioch. The letter from James being couriered to Antioch by, Paul tells us in Galatians 2:12, certain men from James, those from the circumcision. This hypothesis is further supported by James' condemnation in James 5:6, ostensibly giving tacit approval. Listen to this here in James' letter. Ostensibly giving tacit approval to the Jewish vigilante justice against Paul in Lystra, which was meted out only months prior to James' authorship of the letter. What did he say in 5:6? He writes, you condemned, he has Paul in his sights here, you condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you. Who is that? This is the Jew who was a keeper of the law of Moses, who was deceived by Paul to forsake Moses. That's who James is writing about in 5:6 when he says, you, second person, having the Paul and his teaching ministry in view here, you condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you. We talked about in the earlier teaching on that discontinuity passage at the start of chapter 5. So in short, James, and I'm finished with the 7 sequential items here. Summing it up, in short, James is finishing his letter here in verses 17 through 20, particularly verses 17 and 18, dealing with Elijah here, with an elusive and unorthodox substitution of the word aner, andre man, which is the normal word that would have been used for a Jew under the law, blessed because he's under the law, instead using anthroman, with a like nature with us, an anthroman who's like us, a Jew in his nature, which itself serves as James' dog whistle to certain informed readers, among whom would be the high priest and Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. In other words, anthroman, with a like nature with us, is an enigmatic elliptical echo. He's echoing the word. He wants you to hear Paul's own words at the fateful vigilante riot in Lystra that occurred months earlier in AD 47, which had occurred, as I write here, which had occurred only months prior to Paul's own words at the fateful vigilante riot in Lystra. Again, which had occurred only months prior to the provenance, the writing of James' letter in AD 48. And the equally fateful, he's echoing the equally fateful misrepresentation by the diaspora Jews relating to Paul's use of these words in order that they might do away with him. Sadly, this misrepresentation now includes James and the Jerusalem church with the letter from James. And Paul would attribute this in Galatians. Paul's response to the letter from James is the letter of Galatians. At the end of Galatians, Paul says what's going on here. He says that James and the Jerusalem church did this, Paul's words, solely in order that they might not be persecuted. Paul says in his response, in his letter to the Galatians, that their response was out of fear that they otherwise would be persecuted by the Jews. And they probably would have. In this manner, James introduces the prayers of Elijah for drought in James 5:15, in James 5:17, and then rain in James 5:18, which form an inclusio around the heroic story of Elijah the prophet versus the false prophets of Baal. Thusly, does James end his letter with such a harsh, if also slightly veiled, reprimand against Paul and his mission to the Gentiles. On the one hand, identifying Paul's mission with the prophets of Baal, and on the other hand, identifying the newly launched Judaizing counter mission from Jerusalem with Elijah, the prophet of God. This is what James is doing here in this passage. The AD 48 provenance of James' letter, the Antioch incident, and Paul's first letter, Galatians, respectively, as the sequential circumstances motivating the Jerusalem Council meeting of AD 49, which we read about in Acts 15, are hardly to be explained otherwise. In other words, it's difficult to explain the meeting that took place in Jerusalem other than these advance events, the riot at Lystra, the writing of the letter of James, the Antioch incident with men coming from James, and then Paul writing the letter of Galatians, are all the precursors to then the meeting that took place at Jerusalem in AD 49 that you read about in Acts chapter 15. Okay, second exposition's a little bit shorter. We'll go a little bit faster. The reprimand and condemnation. We're going to kind of give an overview here of the two-part recommendation, commendation. I want you to have a good sense of what's happening. Having this pretext with the correlation to the riot in Lystra, and knowing that James is echoing that very strongly with the very words he's using in these prayers of Elijah to bring into view the prophets of Baal that Elijah slayed. And that's the setup for his final passage where he commends this counter mission coming from Judea that is going to turn back the Jews who have been deceived by the teaching of this Pauline mission, turn them back to Moses, thereby saving their souls and racking up lots of credits to their benefit, covering a multitude of sins. That's the whole picture there. So let's work on this second exposition. Again, this is a writing that could really be standalone aside from the fact that it explains what James is doing in verses 17, 18, and 19 and 20 here. I title it Reprimand and Commendation. This is for the entire 4-verse passage here. The reference to the prayers of Elijah in James 5, 17, 18 might seem a rather strange illustration from Scripture for the preceding exhortations into prayer on behalf of weaknesses and sins, right? That's what he had just taught on in the preceding passage, verses James 14 through 16. Casual readers of the letter from James, which was written in AD 48, might wonder why James would not have used some other scriptural reference for this purpose. Why this passage from Elijah? For instance, he might have used Exodus 15:26, which refers to God as Yahweh Rapha. He says, I am God, the one healing you. Yahweh Rapha. It's a very well-known saying from the writing from Torah that casts God as the healer. Yahweh Rapha would have been a good one to use, or the ordination of Isaiah in Isaiah 6, verses 9 through 10, where Isaiah speaks about those turning away from God, and that they might return in order that God might heal them. That would have been maybe a more expected scriptural reference here in this closing passage to tie into the verses or the previous pericope where he talked about the prayer practices at Jerusalem. Those were just two examples that might have been a little bit more obvious. But why this passage from Elijah? That's strange. Rather, these obscure and awkward references to the prayers of Elijah for drought and rain can only be understood in the context of James' polemical purpose against Paul's recent mission among the synagogues of the diaspora in South Galatia, which took place only recently in AD 47. Therefore, indeed, in James 5:13, right, the first verse of that previous pericope, where he's talking about prayers because of suffering evil. James' exhortation into prayer for those suffering evil correlates very closely with his literary purposes with the prayers of Elijah. Prayers because of suffering evil. James 5:17 refers to Elijah's prayer for drought in 1 Kings, chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. I'm not going to read that passage, but that's the reference for you. 1 Kings, chapter 17, verses 1 through 7 is Elijah's prayer for drought. And James 5:18 refers to Elijah's prayer for rain, then in 1 Kings at the end of chapter 18. 1 Kings 18, verses 41 to 46, if you want to read about the prayer of Elijah to restore the rain. It may be reasonably supposed that James invoked these two stories at the beginning of 1 Kings chapter 17 and at the end of 1 Kings chapter 18 in particular to infer the disastrous fate of the 450 false prophets of Baal who ate at the table of the Gentile queen Jezebel. Who was the queen to the unrighteous king Ahaz of the northern tribes of Israel. The false prophets of whom Elijah slayed at the base of Mount Carmel after their failed offering to the false god Baal. Not coincidentally, then, the prayers of Elijah for drought, which James writes about in verse 5:17, and then restoration of rain in James 5:18, form an inclusio around this heroic story of the prophet of God Elijah versus the false prophets of Baal. More to the point, the story bookended by this Old Testament prayer inclusio is the saga of the northern tribes of Israel who had fallen away from the God of Israel and were worshiping the pagan gods Asherah and Baal. So in short, James had two rhetorical purposes with these two prayer bookends of this literary inclusio, 1 Kings 17:1 through 18:46, two chapters in the book of 1 Kings. First, James was comparing Paul's mission to the Gentiles, which was also drawing not a few diaspora Jews away from both obedience to Moses and the synagogue assembly. And he was comparing this with this Pauline mission with the Gentile queen Jezebel and her pagan false prophets. At arm's length, James was implicating Paul himself as a false prophet who was leading the people astray. Under Moses, this was a sin warranting nothing short of stoning to death, which not coincidentally Paul had suffered at the hand of the Jews only months earlier in Lystra. Secondly, James was comparing the newly launched Judaizing countermission from the church in Jerusalem to the prophet of God, Elijah, where Paul referenced certain men away from James, those from the circumcision, who showed up with James' letter at Antioch in AD 48, teaching, which you can read about in Acts chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, that these men were teaching, except ever you might be circumcised in the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And 1 year later, after the Antioch incident in AD 49, James would finally excuse the Gentile Christians from the requirement of circumcision, albeit only by omission. Talk about this more next week, the meeting of AD 49. Nevertheless, the Judaized Christian doctrine of what Paul called the heteros euangelion in Galatians 1:6, which was memorialized in the New Testament letter from James, would remain the mantra of the Judaizing countermission that would dog Paul all the remaining years of his missionary ministry. You can read about that in Romans 16:17 and 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 13 through 15. If you want to read about the same Judaizing countermission from Jerusalem, those are two references, one in Romans, one in 2 Corinthians. The reviling implication of James chapter 5, verses 17, 18 on these prayers from Elijah would have been immediately noted by Paul, who was the Hebrew of Hebrews and former Pharisee that we read about in his own letter, Philippians, verse 3-5, who would not read of Elijah's prayers without a clear understanding of James' rhetorical purpose to invoke the renowned confrontation of two different schools of prophets, the 450 calling upon Baal versus Elijah calling upon the God of Israel. Paul, through his first reading of James' letter, had certainly recognized James' polemical purpose against his mission to the Gentiles. And so, Paul would equally have recognized that just as James 5, chapter 5, verse 17 and 18 was a harsh concluding reprimand against him and his mission to the Gentiles, so also the final passage in James chapter 5, 19 and 20, verses 19 and 20, was James' salutary commendation for the Judaizing countermission that the church in Jerusalem had launched against Paul's mission to the Gentiles. Most certainly, Paul recognized the imminent danger that James' allusion to the ancient prophetic confrontation posed to both himself and those who would follow in his footsteps. In other words, Paul realized that the Judaizing countermission from Jerusalem would use the letter from James not only to cast his mission to the Gentiles under the shadow of the prophets of Baal, but even himself into the shadow of Jezebel. In short, the letter from James posed a deadly threat to the ministry given to Paul by the Lord some 14 years earlier on the road to Damascus. Thusly did Paul then write his first New Testament letter in AD 48, right on the heels of this letter from James. As his own polemical response, both to the recent incident at Antioch and to James' letter, not only for the sake of the fledgling Antiochian and Galatian believers, but also for the eyes of the church leaders in Jerusalem and their newly launched Judaizing countermission against Paul's mission to the Gentiles. These events in AD 48, James' letter, the Judaizing countermission from Jerusalem, the Antioch incident, and Paul's written response in Galatians would catalyze into Paul's third post-conversion trip to Jerusalem and the fateful meeting with the church leaders there just months later in AD 49, which we read about in Acts chapter 15. So I'm going to finish today with that, on that note, and next week we'll focus more. This week we focus mostly on 17 and 18, the prayers of Elijah. I may say a few more things about that next week, but next week will be focused and dedicated mainly to the next two verses, the final passage, which is James' commendation to this Judaizing countermission that is going out against Paul's mission and ostensibly to save those Jews and Christians who have been deceived by Paul and are forsaking Moses, and bring them back into the fold, restore their zealotry for Moses. We'll talk about that more next week. All right, church, that's a lot. You have gotten a lot today. Thank you for staying with me. And we'll finish this discussion next week in part 2 of James' final pericope that I call the final exhortation. We'll see you then.